Again, I'm sorry I can't be down there. I really wish I'd had a little bit more of a window. It's a little bit harder to justify the 8 or 9 hour drive for only, a few days. So it would have been, I'd like to do a 5 day minimum just because there's so much to see whenever I'm back in Florida. That being said, this isn't ideal, but I'm hoping that everyone can still get, something good out of this. And it's a lot of slides, but I'm going to fly through a lot of the first half just because it's kind of more fun pics, me reminiscing about all the fun I had in Florida, and then I'll get into the flora stuff after. Okay, so like I said, let's start with just some floristic fun from Florida. So here's just some pics from my time in Florida. This is a formerly famous, maybe still partially famous tree at Highlands Hammock. I was 19, so it was my first time seeing Central Florida. I didn't really know much about, the time I'd be spending there eventually doing research, like on some asters in the plant ecology lab. And then meeting some botany friends as well, doing a lot of collecting, even getting to burn a little bit at Archbold. And then again, getting out, especially with Alex and Lily quite a bit, Alex de la Paz, and you guys know Lily. So even in my time there too, Eric Menges here, kind of, Florida fire ecology legend as far as, publications and research and demography and all that fun stuff. Even within my time, that lab changed quite a bit. And so by the time I left, it had been a sort of complete turnover. And then since then, Sterling and Aaron remain, but there's been also some changes. It's just, something that happens a lot at research stations. But there's always great minds, in and out of that place. So I do miss having some really fun research times there. Um, so yeah, Lily kind of mentioned the first couple, first year or two, we would link up quite a bit with our friend Alex. I was living in kind of West Central Florida, Alex in Gainesville and Lily in the Panhandle. So we would do various trips across the state, collecting and photographing. And here I think I had to prop Alex up to get a pic of this may have been it, but probably a ghost orchid or something really fun like that. That's just teamwork right there. And then since then, been able to explore some parts of the Southern Appalachians a little bit more, places like Linville Gorge here behind on the left, and then trying to branch out into the tropics more. I'd really like to get down into Central and South America more. This was just a little taste of Puerto Rico on the right. And then I'm still able to really study interesting fire things up here. The coastal plain is the coastal plain. Florida's portion of the coastal plain, in my opinion, is botanically so rich and interesting, but you still get lots of really good species and interesting communities to study north of there. These are just what the sandhills look like. Recent in, sort of recent regeneration after fire, and then, less than a half year later. You can just see the woody species, the shrubs, the ferns, and lots of the forbs and grasses resprout pretty vigorously. So these are, I'll get into resilience in a second here. I've also been really lucky at my position to be able to teach the workshops I've always wanted to teach. So recently we did one part of a fall flora course that I sort of had carte blanche to design. And I specifically wanted to do an entire workshop one day on just identifying asters, dissecting heads, pulling them out in the microscope. Not only does it teach me a lot, but I think people that don't normally look at asters, in a really intensive way get a ton out of it. And I think we had a good session there. And we're going to do grasses for the third session. We had the second session out in the field, and then we'll do Poaceae. So fall flora to me means pulling out the microscopes and tweezing and doing all these fun dissection things. Even out in the field, again, courses I want to teach, groups that I like to study and have some aptitude to teach, maybe not an expert, but have studied them enough that I can teach some of the basics. So sedges, graminoids, again, getting the microscopes out. People are really amazed at these small structures that they see. And eventually I'd like to pivot maybe. I still really need to make time for research and teaching and all the flora responsibilities, but eventually it would be fun to do more of these workshops. They're just a little bit expensive. I have to travel and, obviously that adds up over time. Part of the reason too is a little bit of challenge coming down, not financially, but just the time too, right? I also get some help every now and then by one of my cats in particular really likes checking out things when I'm in the microscope. And then it's hard to tell here from this picture. And our I learned our AC had just kind of broken a little bit in the room, but I was actually sweating doing some Paraginia dissection here on a rare character. So, botany can get pretty extreme even just back at the scope. So, as a reminder, and Lily mentioned this too, I spent a lot of my time while as a full-time resident of Florida, kind of living in West Central Florida, doing lots of commuting. Definitely doing commuting this way too to just kind of get some cultural sort of fun flavors, right? But a lot of ecology, demography work on the southern half of the Lake Wells Ridge. And then, we were really fortunate too to get down to the Keys all the way over near Pensacola. So really explored lots of the state. And in these places, especially in North Florida, where I really first started learning just some woody plants in Florida, I just was amazed at how quickly some of these dominant species resprout, how vigorous they are after fire. So, Sereno repens, saw palmetto is the sort of classic example. Um, it doesn't really like getting flooded out, so in really high precip years, we think that it gets knocked back a little bit in some of those mesic to scrubby transition zones. But such a dominant sort of prehistoric dinosaur-like plant, right? It just is good at what it's doing. It's done it for thousands of years. It can handle fire and disturbance pretty well. It can even handle absurd, roller chopping, right? So these are really resilient species. This was maybe 5 or 6 months after a fire had escaped from the railroad next to Archbold and burned a lot of the seasonal ponds. And this was when they were dry, but the areas that are, seasonal ponds later in the year in the wet season and the mesic scrubby flatwoods, after about 5 months, you can see it looks pretty lush, right? And so this is sort of what I'll kind of refer to as the sort of broad scrubby flatwoods of the central Florida ecosystem. But you can see there's really quick ecozone or ecotones or ecological transition zones between communities because I'll talk about in a second, elevation is relative in Florida. So, it's sort of a catch-all, but scrubby flatwoods is pretty dominant in this part of Florida. And what's cool is we even have a few pics from like the CCC days of when the main building at Archbold was built. It was sort of designed to be like a railroad stop, and it just never really, not enough population really called for that. But it's still this great, awesome building that houses all these research stations still. And you can see in the back there, really not too many pines. And, there are definitely people who've looked into some of this historical stuff, and it's just really amazing to have pictures of this quality. And as a lot of parts of Florida were still relatively underdeveloped or undeveloped even right after, World War II. So it's just cool. It's cool to be able to see some of these reference photos because we don't have it for a lot of the Eastern U.S., right? That sort of was colonized by Europeans a lot sooner, and then all these changes started cascading, right? Okay, so this sort of theme that I like to sort of draw on is this idea of resilience and adaptation, right? Ecological resilience. This is a sort of typical scene again. You'll see I just continue to highlight Central Florida just because it's such an interesting area I know pretty well. But these areas are dominated, these wet pine savannas are dominated by cutthroat grass. And shortly after fire, you get immediate regeneration. And then a couple months or so, depending on when the fire occurs, you'll get prolific flowering and then seed set. And all this is possible because Colotynia abscissa, cutthroat grass, again, that dominant grass in that slash pine savanna, has these vegetative structures that help the meristems to not be singed in fire and then they can resprout. Not all species flower prolifically right after firing, but some of them do, like this species. And then just, to whittle in some actual botany here, just to make sure we're all, keeping our brains fresh and realizing, it's not too bad actually after all. Some of these differences are not super complicated to sort of tell apart a few species within a genus like Colotynia, right? And some things just as simple as plants with, well-established rhizomes or hard crowns. So this hard crown again, we're sort of talking about helps to protect the tissues right within these meristems and then resprouting. You can think of most grass that you mow or that cows chew on, right? Grasses are great at concentrating those tissues and then resprouting. So even just differences between these sort of things we call crowns and rhizomes can be helpful in identifying species. So this was an area a little further north, kind of near the Polk and Highlands County border. Pretty typical, so more or less sandhill scene of what's left in the area. There had been some miscommunication and some turkey oaks had been cut here, but nothing really too substantial. And luckily, they burned right after. So within, again, 5 months, we're seeing prolific Lytris tenuifolia, lots of resprouting and other species. So just really imparted on me this idea of ecological resilience. And yeah, just also it's great to look at, right? It's awesome to just see these scarred or charred landscapes transform into this bright purple. And of course, this is something in the Magnolia chapter I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. There's so much contiguous habitat in the Panhandle, so you get scenes like this in Apalachicola National Forest and further west in Blackwater River State Forest. So, these are things that I know people are familiar with in the room here, right? And then again, just to impart some dichotomous key knowledge onto y'all. So this is a complex too of Lytris that were had been variously recognized at certain species or infraspecific rank for some time, and then eventually published again with a little bit more research and time spent on some of those morphometrics. And now we have good info going forward in trying to tell apart these microspecies. And Tenuifolia is pretty easy to tell apart from the other two, but Quadriflora and Levigata can just get a little challenging sometimes, maybe even areas where they can kind of mingle. But for the most part, we're building on these sort of years and decades of botanical generation or botanical knowledge, right? Of course, Lytras have these great USOs or underground storage organs called corms. This is like a swollen basal part of the stem. And this is where, the plant can again regenerate after the above ground parts are exposed to fire. Runner oak is like the, exemplary fire resilient species. I mean, it's a low growing oak in regularly burned habitats. It, rarely gets above the size of your knee, but it produces acorns bigger than some of our live oaks. So it's really a cool plant to witness and to sort of spend some time with and sort of say, okay, I wonder what's going on underneath the ground, right? Well, this is like a geoxylic shrub. It's like an underground tree, right? And so if you were to look at the biomass on some of these really crazy resprouters, it would be, significantly higher in most cases, underground to shoot ratio, so root to shoot ratio. You'll hear ecologists talk about. And Serenoa is one that can easily have 8-to-1 ratio, so 8%, eight times more biomass underground than above ground. So yeah, underground trees, geoxylic shrubs. Of course, this is the other oak we think of, right? These massive live oaks. So yeah, these are both oaks. They both have found a strategy, right? And it's effective for their persistence. And then again, just to remind you that there are some keys that won't bite you too hard. So this is just a classic example of once you've gone through some higher couplets, yes, that can be the challenging part, right? But once you get to these digestive points, you can just ask yourself these basic questions. Is this a plant I'm looking at is a stoloniferous shrub to about a meter tall? And then, obviously producing acorns, reproducing at that size. Or is this plant I'm looking at a small to large tree? Well, it's pretty clear here. Most live oaks are large trees, and most runner oaks are stoloniferous shrubs. So pretty simple. I won't get into oak hybridization, all that fun, right? And then, of course, Florida is this land of like extreme seasonality and weather. So this is like what the pond apple sloughs in South Florida look like at the end of the dry season. So like in that May, sort of early June transition period. And there's just still too much moisture retained and too much thick pond apple litter on the ground to, you would have to really have an extreme fire and extreme drought to be able to carry fire through this system. And then this is not the exact same um, place. This is actually from Big Cypress, and this is Fakahatchee, where there's often more goosemania. But you can just see how much more inundated these systems are at the end of the wet season. And then, of course, a lot of people in this chapter are probably familiar with this famous tree in Apalachicola. This is a great pick by Alan Kressler. Within a few weeks, sometimes if there's lots of rain, you can just be standing in water. That's probably the wettest I've ever seen it, but it's more typical to see it kind of as this more saturated, sort of wet cypress pine mixed savanna, but just tons of Sarracenian fun herbaceous diversity as well. This is the Peace River, kind of close to this was along my drive I took on those longer commutes, and I always amazed to see the transition of the water levels in the Peace River at the end of the dry season compared to, the wet season. This wasn't even as high as it got after I'd moved a couple years later, or sort of the next fall after I had moved up to North Carolina, Hurricane Ian struck west central or sort of southwest central Florida, kind of near Port Charlotte, and just dumped so much rain. And you can just see how parts of State Route 70 here weren't even passable. I used to take this drive all the time. So the picture I kind of showed earlier was like, a little bit, I think, further down this way. So all of these pastures with live oaks that really don't hold water a lot of the year were just completely flooded out. So it's a very broad flood zone. And we know a lot of people, right, suffer damage and were flood, that campground that's right there along 70 was obviously flooded again. So these are, storms that obviously have immense impacts on humans as well. This is a storm. Of course, a lot of people are in this in the room or in this Zoom room are familiar with Hurricane Michael. Completely transformed a lot of the Panhandle. I was lucky to have experienced places like Torreya State Park in March of 2018 before Michael struck later that year. So you can just see how much the canopy has changed here. And of course, a lot of people are familiar with this, just having spent time in the areas that Michael impacted. And then oops, I couldn't help but put this pickup. This was from a visit maybe a year and a half or so ago in the Steinhatchee area. And just to see this FEMA sign with three major hurricanes that had kind of hit that area was really surreal, just to think about human resilience as well, and just the impacts of a warming ocean, right? The impacts of a warming Gulf. So all of these are sort of coming to sort of impact society in big ways. And botanically as well, right? These storms have impacts. Individual orchids, right? That botanists love and seek out and love to photograph, even with all the mosquitoes and salt marsh areas, are near and dear to our hearts. And these individuals as well are being impacted by these storms. This was like a famous cigar orchid. I would just miss this before it had fallen after Hurricane Irma. It would have been great to see this behemoth cigar orchid. So again, elevation is relative in Florida, and you can just see this in a lot of parts of the peninsula as well. You guys get a little bit more topography up there, like especially in the Clay Hills area, but you can stand and look across two other distinct communities, right? These plant community zones, like zonation was sort of the theory that described this, right? And then even within the wetlands, we can see zonation pretty easily because of the really simple changes in elevation that are needed to do this sort of thing in Florida, and also because of the height of the water table. So you can see where distinct zones of certain species drop out and give way to others, even within a single wetland, depression, marsh, or pond. And then in the Everglades too, it's like even more apparent, right? You can just stare out at some of the overlooks and see these little tiny isolated hardwood hammocks. These are mostly tropical or subtropical hardwood hammocks that have a completely different community than the sawgrass marsh with dwarf cypress around it. So really fun to see like what a foot or two will do in this part of the state. And then, of course, we have really dramatic, sort of alien-like landscapes with cool sort of forms of erosion, right? Like the steephead topography area in Torreya, such a unique zone. I'd love to just spend more time in there and learn everything I can, and I've been lucky to have explored that a little bit. And in the areas where they had logged historically, and then sometimes they've replaced with wiregrass and restored pretty well, you can just see how quickly those steep heads sort of form. So really dramatic changes in elevation too. Obviously, you have a completely different community assemblage. Okay, I'm going to go through this a little bit quick. We're familiar with longleaf pine cone, right? This sort of cool life cycle where you have the grass and the bolting stage, right? Pines want to get out of that hot fiery zone so that they can get to maturity and produce cones and continue the cycle. We also know that we're not just talking about longleaf pine in the broad sense of the longleaf pine ecosystem. We're talking about wiregrass and turkey oak and a suite of other oaks and hardwood species, but then especially tons of grasses and forbs and orchids and all sorts of fun biodiversity, right? These are sort of flip-flopped, right? If you turn this ecosystem upside down, it'd be sort of like an inverted triangle, right? So much of the diversity sits in the understory of the longleaf pine, the broad longleaf pine ecosystem, especially in the wet longleaf pine savannas. And of course, as humans, we're always competing a little bit and calculating, right? And quantifying. So, there's been lots of researchers who've wanted to really prove their ecoregions, right? And really show how diverse and how diverse these understories are. And the sort of famous story was that for the longest time, the sort of record at the meter squared level, again, just 1 meter by 1 meter square, was about 35 species published for the Green Swamp area of North Carolina. And they kind of sat on that for a while, and then all sorts of publications came out, right? And then it was really brought to my knowledge that from Brett Budak specifically, his work in Missouri showed some of these meter squared quadrats to hold up to as much as 46 species. And so anything above 20, I mean, even 15 for some parts of the coastal plain is pretty good. So to get upwards of 46 species in Missouri prairies, and then easily around those number, probably a little bit lower in some fringing prairie systems in Florida is pretty incredible. And that's just what the coastal plain's all about, microsite diversity. And of course, in the longleaf pine, if we radiate outwards a little bit, we can easily get over 100 species in just a short area. And then these are just two related gentians. Some of our most beautiful species grow in the longleaf pine, wet or mesic or dry ecosystem, including autumnalis and pinelliana. This is obviously one that some folks are probably familiar with here. It's endemic to Apalachicola, the Apalachicola area. This is what a quadrat often looks like in a lot of acidic, dry, nutrient-poor, artificially shaded habitats, which has come to dominate the southeastern landscape. There's no vascular plants in this quadrat. So this is what a meter square quadrat of zero vascular plants looks like. 0 to 10 species is really going to be common in a lot of disturbed, fragmented areas, or even in some natural areas too. Why? Because some habitats just don't support a lot of biodiversity, right? But they can still be interesting, but they're just not diverse like the other systems we were talking about. And then yes, even pines are not safe from the dichotomous key pain and suffering we all must endure, right? As botanists. No, I'm just kidding. So it's really easy to tell apart longleaf if you're having some trouble. Just look for these fimbriate or fringed bud scales and bracts. So this is really going to be a telltale sign that you're looking at longleaf. What's cool about longleaf too is it sort of drops out in southwest Florida, get a few scattered populations, right? And then otherwise South Florida slash pine picks up. And then this is really becomes the dominant pine unless you're in sand pine areas or longleaf areas on the ridge that are dry enough and have sands to support a habitat that formerly probably would have been more savanna-esque, but aren't scrubby like rosemary scrub. So again, here's just a pic of how that South Florida slash pine Pinus densa looks. It's easy. It's a little bit easier to tell just from form. I kind of learned pines just from how they look from afar. The cones are great too, but for me, like seeing different shapes of broccoli, I guess is, helpful, but maybe not for others. And then South Florida slash pine in places like Big Pine Key, which are apparently virgin longleaf. They weren't logged because they just grow so slowly. They weren't really that valuable for timber. And so, again, to see the sort of wide range of how pine savannas look across Florida is pretty crazy. Longleaf pine, of course, does some interesting things and assembles differently outside of Florida. It really becomes like more of an intermingled species when you get out of the coastal plain province. So places like the Piedmont and Ridge and Valley have some really cool longleaf areas. And in the Uwharries National Forest, which is about 2 hours from where I live in the upper Piedmont, it's not uncommon to see longleaf in some of these upland systems, but you usually are seeing it with shortleaf, where the sort of red arrows are pointing here. You'll see Virginia pine as well, but really it's shortleaf and longleaf kind of intermingled with a suite of oaks and other hickories and upland hardwood species. So really helpful again to just inform our knowledge, through travel. So just fun to see these different themes. And then the things growing right next to longleaf even differs a little bit, right? We're used to seeing maybe bayheads in a lot of Florida, but in parts of Croatan National Forest and in like the North Carolina coastal plain, it's not uncommon to see these really nice sandhill ridges in areas that are still protected, growing literally right next to pond pine precocens. You can see how spindly pond pine looks here compared to the longleaf. So just two completely different ecosystems with a really sharp ecotone. And then if people are familiar with Broxton Rocks, one of my favorite places in the South, really all that remains, in my opinion, of the once prosperous botanical areas Roland Harper would frequent. You could probably take him, time travel, plop him down at Broxton, but you'd have to blindfold him on the way there because he would probably just go, I don't recognize where I'm at. So, and I say this because I was just recently down in South Georgia looking for a plant he described that really has not been seen by a ton of people across a ton of populations, and it's just maybe not here, right? It's just this is a great site, but it maybe doesn't support this one really boggy ringhospora. So I could go on about this, but I'm just really grateful that TNC knew that this was a special place and preserved it however long ago, and it's managed with fire. And the recent hurricane damage from Helene really wasn't too bad, especially to some of the compared to some of the areas I've seen in that were impacted by Michael. So yeah, what's really cool, sorry, that was a long ramble, but what's cool is like you'll be looking at longleaf savanna here, and it's sort of intermingled with these acidic sandstone barrens, and there's some rare species that occur, but they're really edaphic, right? They're stressful, they're really dry, thin soil, so you get like all sorts of cool soil crust and like little mosses and lichens. So just cool to see a really interesting variation on a theme. We know that the southeastern US flora is pretty closely evolved with fire, and we know through dendrological studies looking at fire scars that fires were pretty frequent in some of these parts of Florida, especially areas like the treeless dry prairie ecosystem, right? The Florida dry prairie is really lacks trees because it's just a habitat that burns this frequently is not sustainable for woody plants, right? You really have to be an underground tree or an herbaceous or sort of forb species here. And then there's some, this sort of number and that fire return interval can vary across some habitats. The sawgrass marshes of the Everglades and dwarf cypress savannas, they can vary quite a bit, but some maybe we anticipate burn pretty frequently. Seepage slopes, bogs really are best maintained with frequent fire and probably within a certain season as well. These are colloquially called bogs down south, but I'm a Yankee, so bogs always meant rain-fed peatlands, and because these are groundwater fed, I just like to nerd out and be really robotic about it. So, fens is sort of similar to bogs, but they're really these cool seepage slopes, and they're adapted to frequent fire return. In fact, that's how they stay open and herbaceous. Hopping back down to the other part of Florida again, this is like the coastal prairie trail and the very southern tip of Everglades National Park, pretty much at sea level with the buttonwoods and mangroves. So just really cool to hike in some of these sort of saline areas, but still probably a pretty frequent fire return interval. Pine flatwoods dominant across a lot of the state. 1 to 3, maybe a little bit higher in some cases. 3 to 5 or maybe a little bit more, 3 to 7. Sometimes I'd hear for a lot of the sand hills. This is really a wiregrass longleaf sandhill system, right? It's sort of equally important what's going on in the ground layer. And then these low-growing palms are just amazing to admire too. Sabal tenaya, Serrano repens. You can just see these really amazing stems that are basically subterranean but at ground level. And then the pine flatwoods can vary too, depending on, how scrubby they are. So that number is tough to pin down depending on how scrubby it is. We know that rosemary scrub is probably a little bit more infrequent because there's a lot more sand gaps that don't carry fuel as well. So these rosemaries need to grow up a little bit so that there can be connectivity between flames. These sand gaps are also where a lot of the cool rare species are. Things like Polygonella basaramia, right? So Hypericum cumulicola. These are the fun endemic Central Florida things that you look for in this ecosystem. Even some rare lichens. This is a paper just published by Sterling on behalf of the Plant Lab members, former and or prior and current. This was really just a fun project. I was so lucky to be a part of this really cool species, Cladonia perforata. But we sort of have learned over some monitoring that a lot of the populations are generally in decline. Why? Because they're fire sensitive. So really, it may have persisted in areas of like fire shadows, so maybe in hammocks adjacent to scrub over time. But we're still learning a lot of this stuff, right? Cypress swamps, sloughs, right? We're getting way towards the other end where fire is really infrequent. And even at the dry season, we really can tell these sort of things. Right? This is this sort of the general and then more specific kind of habitat cover map across Florida. So much variation in habitat, right? It's not just that one guy at 2012 map, right? Where it's 2 years across all of Florida. No, there's different ecosystems throughout Florida. So on a nuanced level, yeah, we'd expect maybe fire used to trickle along sort of steady along the ground. It would cover great distances, but maybe didn't burn every single part of every habitat. Okay. I went a little bit long. I don't know how long these are, but I'm just going to keep going. Okay. So a flora, I'm just going to move now to the flora stuff, which probably some people were looking forward to more, but I just wanted to reminisce on Florida a little bit. It's fun to go through all these pics and remember the cool areas that I'd like to get back to and botanize again. Okay. So a flora is really, for those not aware, it's a couple things, right? It's an inventory of plants in a given area, the flora of my backyard, the flora of New England, the flora of Texas. And it typically also is a scientific document. It could be a published paper thing or a website, a digital flora. And it sort of helps, it guides the user on how to identify those plants. It also gives information on where those plants occur, right? How those habitats differ. Usually, in some cases, there'll be descriptions of the plant, right? Like how long the petals are, what color they are. So all of these things make something a flora. In the case of the flora of the southeastern U.S., the flora is maintained digitally, so that provides some benefits, and some people like a paper flora. And it really is chunked into three different products now. But it pulls from this thing that Michael Lee built for Allen in the mid 2000s, the mid aughts, called Flora Manager. So again, this builds on, oh, well, I forgot that. This builds on years of botany in the state. I had a slide like this, I think, in March for the FNPS meeting in Gainesville. But we really think of Chapman and Small as being two of the first botanists that really kind of put feet down in the state, really studied the flora, and then published initial floras for the Southeast that gave us so much important groundwork to move forward. I mean, we're still sort of uncovering some of John Kunkel Small's names, some Small's names today. And then people like Olga Lackala, Edwin Bridges and Steve Orzel, Richard Wunderlin, Bruce Hansen at USF, and then Alan Frank formerly at USF, right, have helped to sort of carry this torch forward from that initial groundwork. In our workflow, we pull from information like from publications that I just mentioned from those botanists. The sort of classic workflow, I'll just go quickly, is like, you have the collection part, the ecology, you have herbarium study and herbarium curation, you build floras, you describe species, you study herbarium specimens, systematic revelations come out, people upload observations as citizen scientists, provide feedback as users of the flora, and then folks like me and Alan work with Michael to build the database. Now, of course, it doesn't always have to go in that direction, right? There can be new floras published, new species described, new findings on iNaturalist that all can get added into the database and updated each year. I work a lot on flora writing, so whether that's flora synthesis or just original key writing based upon a group that I've studied. So, again, it's really efficient to use these wonderful floras that have been published for decades, right? But we also want to understand the plants, the group as well, and understand the keys that we're writing. This is just an example of adding in the Myrtaceae for the flora of Florida, FloraQuest. The taxonomy mapping is definitely not everyone's favorite concept as far as the flora, but we do want to understand how our names relate to former floras. I could get into this more afterwards, but just in general, like if you see a name here that's in the flora and you see an equal sign, and then we have a publication, right, Bonap or Flora of the Carolinas, it just means we sort of have a one-to-one relationship that we both were giving them the same names. In some cases, small had just a broad species, so we recognize a more segregate version, a variety of that. So, it can go both ways. We can change the distribution really easily too. Let's say someone finds something in West Virginia mountains, boom, we can kick it up, and then in the next update, you'll see that species map for that part of the flora. Of course, all of these publications come in various form throughout the years, and Alan and I try to keep up with those new names and integrate them into the flora. And these pull on years of publications too, so not just recent descriptions. And then oh, come on. So I did want to point out from this that Shirley Gale published probably one of the most influential Ringhospora monographs around April through July of 1944, which was like a really tumultuous time for Europe and the planet. So, just a reminder that even in some really kind of tough times, there's great botany to be published, right? That's what I was trying to show. But yeah, great drawings in it. Use that monograph quite a bit. Not so much these days, but when I pull it out, I'm always really happy to see the work she put into that. So, because our flora is digital, we can add pictures of our 5-year-old niece standing next to poison ivy for scale. We can add in nice diversity of form pics that help people to learn the general structures of families. So, a lot of people shy away from sedges. Well, they're really basic once you get down to the fruit, and usually those fruit are diagnostic. So, it's actually not that hard of a group compared to some other showier families. We can show things that have long lived in just word form and keys. We can show them now with pics, right? We can show what lateral versus dorsal compression and spikelets look like in Casmantium or river oats versus paspalum, right? So basic differences that maybe, botanists in former generations understood and could see and understood well from their floras. Now we just have such easier access to cameras too, right? With our phones, we can show these things pretty easily, proving our work, right? We can also geek out on orchids, right, and upload random labeled pics, sometimes when we're just feeling that itch. So Cypripedium, is kind of a cool genus. It has these two fused lateral sepals that we call a synsepal. Really, lady slipper's more of a temperate thing, but I'm sure some of you here have seen at least a species or two. Just a really cool species of orchid. Of course, Florida has its own suite of unique orchids. And then illustrating Dichotomous keys is really easy. And because Michael has built the website and understands coding and all of that, we can build these things together and sort of experiment with them. This one is still in development, but we're going to start spicing up our glossary a little bit with better like IRL in real life kind of pictures. So, here's like a picture of an accrescent calyx, right? Where the calyx continues to develop and sort of envelops, right? So if we have actual pictures of these features that, again, have long lived as terms and glossaries, then I think it's going to pull a lot more people into this sort of comfort zone as far as botany is concerned. We can compare really similar looking species and just upload a picture super easily. A lot of people have these pics on their iNats already as well. So those that have opened up those permissions, thank you again. And we're still updating photos every week. This is just the, 7 species you can see of Eupatorium in the Sandhills Gamelan area in a single unit. So like to see that diversity really helps us to comprehend what genera can look like. Aster, a family again I've just really fell in love with in the past few years and studied pretty intensely. Just so many different forms. I really like, Verbicina, for instance, Chapmanii. This is Apalachicola endemic. It's really unique. Most Verbicina have ray florets, right? So it's kind of cool to see how Apalachicola has transformed yet another thing. And then when they turn to seeds, the Keens or the Cypsela are kind of cool. They have interesting pappus. So yeah, I've just been really digging in on these and then uploading the pics as I go. Hopefully other people will find them useful. And then one thing I'm really trying to work more on is getting helpful images in higher couplets. So many of you have maybe gotten to a key before at the very top of a diverse group, and you have to make decisions high up that affect the key down, right? And so you really need to make important decisions up front, or you kind of want to give up on the key, or you get lost. So if we can add in what these images, like how these images match the wording of the couplets, I think again we're going to pull more people into the more technical but still digestible part of botany. And then as a shout out too of as far as asters, right? We all miss and love Lauren Anderson. He was a synanthrologist. He studied asters, especially out west, and even has a genus name for him, Laura Andersonia. It's one of the Ericomerias. It's like a rabbit bush. Um, and then he even described some rare asters from Florida, right? Hastiola robertiorum, and then worked on the ecology with Edwin and Steve, and other species have been studied all around the state by these three botanists, right? But yeah, we still love and miss Lauren, and are grateful for the contributions he's made to Florida botany. Okay, so I'm gonna go a little quick and then just show one video and then I'll be done. And then I have all this extra stuff so people, if they want to stick around, but I'll try to stay within a good time frame here if that works. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Flora is converted into three products, right? We have the PDF, which for years was sort of the foundation, right? What people used. Now we have the website, which continues to be updated all the time. We're continuing to add features, photos, all that good stuff. And then, of course, FloraQuest, which is a suite of at current four mobile apps that are really great for the field. They're really great for field use. They work remotely. You just buy it once and it's updated with our Flora updates every year. So a really great investment for a sort of small buy. The web app is great though too. And again, we're not trying to downplay FloraQuest, but we still or downplay the website. But I'm just going to highlight FloraQuest specifically here today. But you can dig into some of these shortcuts later, and uh, I urge you all to explore the website as well. So we currently again have four apps out now covering 19 states, and we'll just have one more afterwards that covers 6 states, and that one's going to take probably quite a bit longer than these other ones. Florida took probably about 9 months of like pretty consistent keying on my part, and then Alan would come in and help on certain things, but he's been working on our big taxonomy crosswalk. So, just one person finishing all the subtropical stuff in South Florida took like 9 months in addition to all the other stuff I had to do. So it is quite time intensive, but you want to be thorough about it. You don't want to have to do it multiple times. You just want to modify the key once, have it be good, and then people use them, and then you can get feedback and edit if you need to. So again, this is just a map of showing the 6 states that'll be covered. Kansas just a tiny bit in the sixth app. We're hoping maybe a year, a little bit more than a year. We'll see how this winter goes. And you can access these apps by going to the UNC Chapel Hill Herbarium website. Again, it's a one-time purchase of $20. And that's $20 for one digital Flora app that fits in your pocket and is field ready versus, hundreds of dollars, which, again, we're not trying to shortcut all these great authors. There's so much good information in these, but we just wanted to produce something that was really gonna get people out using the app more that maybe wouldn't have been into botany originally. And again, you can just find that on the iOS store or on Google Play. So I'm going to go through this example and then I'll wrap things up. So let's say we're out in the field in the sort of panhandle area and we see this aster again. And, boy, it's been a while. I don't really remember the difference between, I don't know, Silphium and Helianthus. And I can't remember how many Helianthus there are. I don't even know if it's a Helianthus, right? So let's just walk through a quick example of how we could go about IDing this. So I'm just on my iPad thing. I'm going to open up FloraQuest Florida. This is your splash screen. And then this is just the menu you get to when you open up. So pretty simple, right? It's arranged alphabetically by scientific, and you can change that by going up here to this three-line thing. Again, you can just scroll for fun, kind of see what all the butylons look like. You can switch this to common name, and you can see here we just have a few palazoneurons without images. But if I go down to like incognito sedge, for instance, right, that sounds kind of interesting. Look at some pics and then, whatever you want to do. It's fun to just peruse this thing. So I go back to scientific. It's just a little easier for my brain. Again, you can quickly click that A up there if you just want to scroll all the way up. And then again, you can switch the geography. So Florida's a big state, right? All right. This is just one more example. You can just type in the Acer Negundo and go to the box elder page if you want to go quickly. So then going back up to this little pinwheel here, this is where we can change our options, right? We don't always want to consider what's in the keys if we want to quickly ID something in the panhandle, right? So you can just toggle on the panhandle and leave off the other three if you'd like. And this may be review for some people, but hopefully some people can learn a thing or two about these features. Okay, so the panhandle's on. You can also download these images and change your screen appearance. I'm definitely a dark screen kind of guy, but whatever tickles your fancy. And then you'll just need the internet to download those images. And you saw that because I didn't have internet when I was doing this. Okay, next, let's just go. This little thing's in the way, but on your menu, you just have four basic windows. So we'll just go right to the one on the right to the right, the graphic key. And you can see at the top here, you can read about the instructions here, and there's even more lengthy instructions for those who really want to dig in on some of the botanical differences here. But we have these sort of separated into groups. So it's mostly a polyclave with a little bit of botanical knowledge needed. But you'll see here, I just can go right to the asters, right? We have a whole group just for that family. It's so diverse. And then this is like a choose as you go sort of option, right? Dichotomous keys, you have to make priority choices from the top. And then if you don't decide those, you can't go further, right? Well, with a graphic key or a polyclave, a multi-axis key, you just choose what you know, right? Or what you're comfortable answering. So let's say I'm in a wet kind of soil or in like a pine savanna, it's in full sun. I'll just assume it's native, it's in a nice quality savanna, and it was maybe flowering around September, right? So this is the story for at least 132 asters in the Florida Panhandle, right? Still pretty diverse. So now I'm going to hone in a little bit more on those characters. This is, by the way, a species, for those not familiar, it has really rough leaves as well. So there's some sensory things here to be gained. So we'll just put in, and then again, sorry, well, you'll see in a second. You can go to the genus too. Let's say if you really think you know it's a helianthus, you just go up here and you can type that in. But I'll just leave it blank for this exercise. I don't know if it's a helianthus. I will click basal leaves prominent because in that pic that I showed you, there's a really good rosette of leaves at the base. But then be careful, and just again, if you're not familiar, if you don't know it, then don't answer it. But just make sure to choose the right icon here. So the stem leaves are opposite. It also still has a really pronounced basal rosette. So each time I do this, I'm narrowing my options. So I've got it down to 3 just by selecting these 3 extra icons. I haven't even had to select the type of florets or, floret color. So when I hit that, you hit show basically up here. So once you get down to your options, you hit show, and then it will reveal the species that remain given those options, right? And so I see 2 genera, Coreopsis and Helianthus, right? Maybe I don't remember the difference. And so you can scroll through these, you can click on them, see if things start to make sense. Well, the leaves don't really look like this species of Coreopsis, so we're going to rule it out. And again, just the first 2 images are showing here because I don't have internet, but all images will show if you have data connectivity. So again, oh God. Okay, sorry. We're going to just play it and speed up real quick. Okay. So again, I'm starting to look, and given these opposite reduced stem leaves and strong basal rosette, again, the leaves are really rough. It's not showing the extra pictures here. Again, you can download those or they'll show if you have some connectivity. But you can double check that by clicking on this. Sorry. When you when you go through and you have your three options again, if you have below 10, we're still kind of working this out a little bit, but you can convert it to a dichotomous key. So there's only three. It shouldn't be too bad. And then you just answer these questions again. So it's sort of the best of both worlds. In this case, the leaves are opposite, right? So we're going to click on this first one. And then these are just picks that show you kind of the difference, right, between those, including basals. And then it's asking if they're rays or white or yellow. Simple, right? Are the ray florets that sit on the outside of the head yellow or white? Well, we could see that from those images. This includes ligulate, that glossary term. Sorry, we'll move on here. You can click on these terms that sort of help you to understand those couplets. So we clicked on those that have opposite stem leaves, but also with some basal leaves. Again, if I don't know these terms, I can click on all of these glossary terms. This is just showing you some examples. And then sure enough, because our keys are truncated, we only have three options because we've ruled out our other helianthus based upon leaf disposition and ray color. We can then confidently assume it's probably Helianthus heterophilus, savanna sunflower. And then again, if we look at those pics and review it, things are starting to kind of make sense for the plants we were looking at. We can read about them too, wet pine savannas, seepage bogs. Here's the range map, and I thought it was kind of interesting that it's really common only in the Appalachia or the Florida Panhandle, and then gets uncommon or rare elsewhere. So, a lot of species sort of do this. They ramp up when they get to Florida because there's still quite a bit of habitat left. And then if you want to understand what those symbols mean, you can just scroll down from the distribution map. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip past that, but this just breaks down. This is a little truncated here, but this just breaks down the sort of three products, right? The PDF and the FloraQuest app are going to be your best friends for remote field access, and then only one of them costs money, the app, and that's a one-time purchase. Okay, that was a lot, and I'm hoping you guys just didn't feel too awkward to interrupt me the whole time, and I wasn't just mumbling, but I just want to say thank you to Florida Native Plant Society Magnolia chapter. And then if people have any interest in asking questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Sweet. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was perfect. We want to start with anyone in the crowd who might have any questions. We're going to give you the microphone so that online can hear you.
Hey, Scott.
Hey there.
Oh, okay. One of the great useful features of the IBS is the access to images of herbarium specimens. And there's no herbarium specimen access in the app, right? Is there a thought about someday linking the taxa in your flora to things like IBS, which also give access to herbarium specimens?
That's a great question. And yeah, we can, I think we can find I've talked with Michael about this before. We can find ways to pull from CERNAC, which is like the greater consortium of herbaria in the Southeast. And every now and then I can't find an IRL, an in real life kind of photo of a plant if it's super rare, or let's say it's in a group few people have studied. So I'll just upload a herbarium specimen right to the website. So you'll see a few herbarium specimens, but yeah, not as detailed as ISB as the Florida Atlas, which is really a lot more detailed in that sense, and also has a lot of their keys now available for free use online.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else in the crowd have any questions? You can check the chat. Okay.
Just out of curiosity, what Rhine-Cosper are you looking for in South Georgia?
So there's three actually I'm looking for, but sort of in order of rarity. Culixa is probably really just not around. And then Rhynchospora solitaria is one that I've been really digging in on, old collections and old sites. And the problem with both of those species is they really like boggy habitats, high quality, like conservative sort of, seepage, hillside seepage bogs. And a lot of those habitats are just gone. They've just been either converted or fire suppressed. And then punctata is the third one, Rhynchospora punctata. We know that there's some extant populations of that, like even at Broxton, but that one's like pretty rare too. So yeah, those are the three.
Did you have more stuff you wanted to go over, Scott, for those who are willing to sit around and listen?
Yeah. Okay. I probably got to scoot soon. I'm still at work and I'm probably gonna gotta depart at some point, but I do have something really cool. I have a few of John Kunkel Small's photographs I threw up. So not only was he amazing in his flora writing at the time, he was collecting and this is his weed wagon, but he was taking a lot of photos of Seminoles and Miccosukee tribal members as well. Um, and then obviously he was taking pictures of people poaching, orchids from South Florida. But he was also taking pictures of habitats that are gone that we have no analog for, like these sort of pond apple type sloughs that once sat on the edges of pre-dammed Lake Okeechobee. So yeah, I had to throw those up because he's such a legend for doing that. Roland Harper also took some really great photos, but we just have a few more from Central and South Florida from John Kunkel Small. Um,
Let me
we-
ask you, why do you think he was so wrong about fire?
well, he was really wrong about fire because in some ecosystems because he was seeing catastrophic fires hit habitats that had those really long fire return intervals. And fire was spreading into areas and really burning intensely that probably shouldn't have had such intense fires. And I think it put a bad taste in his mouth.
Maybe
He,
because of fire suppression.
Right. And he also, this was, when a lot of people didn't really understand fire, but he wasn't as, I think Roland was a little bit more hip to it, but Small hints towards some of these adaptations. Like he noticed, how these herbs had really crazy USOs, underground storage organs in like the dry prairies, for instance. And it didn't seem like he was quite putting together the pieces, but he would say, I don't remember exactly, but he would say things like, clearly like this is a plant that's really fire adapted, but he wouldn't say anything about fire frequency and return. And I think he was also scrambling to document anything at all. He probably was really busy just like photographing and collecting and traveling. Traveling was even difficult at that time just in Florida. So maybe he just didn't make it a party. But yeah, Roland, I think had a little bit more awareness of that, even though he maybe lacked some awareness when it came to some other things in life.
Nice. Is that the culmination of the
So there's some extra stuff, I think screenshots from the app. Oh, and then I threw in some other pictures too. Oh, there's an iNat button up here too, so you can link to your iNat. Um,
Yeah.
I think what I'll need, yeah, and then these got a little shrunk because I kind of removed, so we'll end it on that one.